Right. Good morning, everyone. This is lecture 20, and we are now at the end of the program. Today, we're going to be talking about modern philosophical theology. Now, the four theologians that I'm going to be examining are not philosophers, really. Schleiermacher is included among philosophers to some extent, but the other three are not normally included among philosophers. They're really systematic theologians. But generally, systematic theologians are heavily dependent on the tools, the instruments of investigation, the language, the terminology of philosophy. And a discussion of these four thinkers, these four Christian theologians, really gives you an idea as to how, in the present time, a very intimate relationship has developed between philosophy and theology. Now, they're not after the postmodernists, even though this is the last lecture. Do not assume that they come after the postmodernists. They are actually before, all of them are actually before the postmodernists. They all died in the mid 20th century. Well, not all. Three of them died in the mid 20th century. One was purely 19th century. But they certainly continue to occupy a very prestigious position in contemporary theological discourse. And they have heavily influenced almost all of the academic theologians that you will encounter. And I suppose you can check them out on YouTube in departments of theology in the leading universities of the world: Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, Harvard, Yale. Many of these universities have really important and productive theology departments, and you will find a number of the modern theologians located there, teaching, lecturing, writing. Modern philosophical theology really is a response, or began as a response to the Enlightenment movement. And the first one that I'm going to be dealing with, Friedrich Schleiermacher, is certainly typical of the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment movement was a movement that initially began as a philosophical enterprise that, for many philosophers, set out to establish the fundamental and accepted truths about the world, about God, and about the universe as understood by Christianity. Began like that. Early modern theologians were, many of them, quite devout Christian practitioners. By the time you get to the later Enlightenment, Kant, the developments after Kant, philosophy becomes extremely secularized. It begins to dissociate itself from traditional religious beliefs. And a kind of war begins to develop between, on the one hand, science and religion, and on the other hand, philosophy and religion, because philosophy continued to, in many respects, adopt the practices and the methodologies of the sciences. So there's a war that, in a way, developed between those two areas of human experience and thought. One of the things that the Enlightenment movement, with its scientific discoveries, had done is that it had disenchanted the world. That's a term that has been used, a term that was used by Max Weber to describe the effects of secularization on the European consciousness. Talked about the world as disenchanted. The world of religion is an enchanted world. It is a world of miracles. It is a world in which people have revelatory experiences. It is a world in which faith dominates over reason, right? It is a world that includes the transcendent. It's really a very enchanted world. Now, philosophy and science has disenchanted the world. And Weber says that that has been the effect of the Enlightenment. And the theologians felt that they had to respond to that reality, the reality of a disenchanted world. And that led essentially to the birth of what is called liberal theology, led by Friedrich Schleiermacher. That liberal theology, to a large extent, spawned a number of other theologies. And as we'll see when we come to the contemporary world picture and the contemporary theological scenario, we are going to find that even though there's a rejection of liberal theology very often, it is still a response to the rise of liberal theology. The theologians are very conscious that they are addressing some of the problems that emerge in liberal theology. The 20th century has witnessed the burgeoning of a number of theological movements, all of them quite interesting, all of them heavily influenced by philosophy and science. And I will mention just a few for you. Neo-orthodoxy, dialectical theology or theology of crisis, which we'll be dealing with when we come to the three last theologians in this discussion. But there's also been a spate of social movements that have generated theological responses. The rise of feminism and the struggle for female equality has led to feminist philosophy, feminism as a philosophical movement, and also the creation of a feminist theology, which seeks to depatriarchalize or demasculinize very much of the language of traditional theology. And then in America, there emerged what is called Black theology, a theology that chose to identify the struggle for civil rights and the struggle for freedom and equality among Blacks with the whole Old Testamental struggle of the Jews to gain freedom from Babylonian captivity and in fact, prior to Babylonian captivity, Egyptian captivity, that struggle to be free. Essentially, the Black theology interprets religion as essentially a struggle for freedom. That was extended to Latin America and became liberation theology. And as liberation theology, many of the great liberation theologians were actually Marxists, who felt that the Marxist revolution would bring about a change in Latin America, a change that would end the economic exploitation of the native peoples, especially Native Americans, and the restoration of true humanity. And then there has been process theology. Process theology is a theology that sees God as process and not as static being. Very similar to what we get, say, in Hegel, where God is an evolving spiritual reality that follows the pathway of a triadic dialectic. And then there is death of God theology. And as you know, Christianity speaks about the death of God. When Nietzsche talks about the death of God, he talks about the death of the concept of God and the death of faith. But here's a new theology that speaks about the death of God, since the central event in the Christian story has very often been regarded as Christ's death on Calvary's cross for man's salvation. So there's a death of God theology that resonates a lot of the Nietzschean worldview that became so very popular in the Western world. This was a period during which a lot of historical research was done. And in fact, it was the rise of a new hermeneutic, a new exegetical method that has been referred to as the historical critical method. That's the dominant method that scholars, theologians, those who are examining biblical writings and ancient archaeology in the Holy Land and so on, this is the kind of method that they use, historical critical method. And there was a famous quest of the historical Jesus, a quest led by people like Albert Schweitzer, among many of the great theologians, and a quest which ended with a kind of dialectic. right? A dialectic that established a fundamental distinction between the Jesus of history on the one hand and the Christ of faith on the other. Radical distinction between them. So that's a brief summary of the theological picture that we get from the late 19th century to the present time. It's an extremely exciting period in Christian theology. It's not something that our lay community is generally exposed to. Adventist theology does not in any way reflect, as far as I know, does not in any way reflect most of these new tendencies in contemporary philosophy. We are totally opposed to liberal theology. We may be sympathetic to some extent with Barthian theology. Not sure that we would be sympathetic to Tillich or Bultmann when we come to them. Our theology really is a Reformation theology, as the theologies of most of the popular North American faiths, evangelical Christianity, Pentecostalism, and so on. Many of these basically new historical developments in North America are in a way really innocent of a lot of the theologizing that has been taking place in Western Europe and also in the universities of North America. But this gives you a fairly good insight into I'm trying to give you a fairly good insight into what has transpired over the last few decades, and to point out that the area of systematic theology is an extremely exciting area, and one that I hope many of you will get into more fully later on. And now for the four major theologians who are regarded as typical of contemporary theology. First, there is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher was a 19th century theologian, born in the 18th century, died in the 19th century. And Schleiermacher was very much perturbed with the effects of the Enlightenment on the Christian tradition, on traditional Christianity. The scientific revolution, the rise of philosophical knowledge, the spread of social movements, the tremendous amount of research that was done in terms of scientific investigation had all radically changed the world picture of modern man, the world picture of Western Europeans. And it was no longer a picture that resembled, in most respects, the world picture of Christianity. And Schleiermacher decided that he would have to respond to that. And he wrote a very interesting book, his first book called On Religion, Speeches to its Cultured Despisers. I remember Schleiermacher was living at the same time as people like Friedrich Nietzsche and so on, Kierkegaard also. And he was living at the time of the Romantic movement, when the Romantic movement was flourishing in Western Europe. Schleiermacher, therefore, was prepared to write over, if you wish, or to revise Christian theology in such a way that it would become palatable or amenable to many of the of those who were so very skeptical of traditional views, and so many people who looked at Christianity with a kind of modernistic contempt. He wanted to redefine Christianity in terms that would be acceptable to that hostile community beyond the church. He came from a pietistic background, and when you talk about pietism was really a very powerful movement in Germany, and that was post Reformation. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, you had not pietism but Puritanism, right? One of the things about pietism and Puritanism was that it was a kind of new orthodoxy within Protestantism that attempted to reflect the very high spiritual and moral standards of the Catholic priesthood, right? The Catholic priesthood had always been distinguished from the laity in the extent to which they made tremendous commitments to things like celibacy and poverty and mendicancy and so on. They always tried to live holy lives in close touch with God. The problem with that is that it was confined only to a few, those in the monasteries, and not recommended or extended to the wider group. Protestantism, many of the Protestants felt that we are all a whole body of priests, right? The church really is a royal priesthood. And if it's a royal priesthood, we should live like priests. And therefore, a number of even though celibacy and virginity were not accepted by pietists and Puritans, yet that was many of the standards, the very high standards, spiritual and ethical standards, right, of the traditional Catholic priesthood were now adopted by people on a large scale, by the lay community within the church. And he came out of that tradition, a pietistic tradition in Germany, corresponding to the puritanical tradition in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Adventism, for example, comes out of that Puritanism, right? Out of Methodism, which has its roots in British Puritanism. And we have still tried to maintain that emphasis on the holiness of the individual. The Schleiermacher came out of that tradition, but he was intellectual, he was a philosopher, right? And his argument was that man himself is a creature that cannot escape, cannot do without, cannot renounce, cannot deny his need for God. You will hear resonances clearly from Augustine. The soul is restless until it finds its rest in God. And what Schleiermacher did was that he tried to establish, like Kant, because Kant had done that in his discourse on practical reason, right? His book on practical reason, he had tried to establish what is called a religious a priori, something in the human psyche, some quality, some element, some tendency, some recognition within the human psyche of the existence of a divine being, right? It's referred to as a religious a priori. And he found that to exist in human imagination and feeling and intuition, which he valued much more highly than human rationality. Again, you can see echoes of Kierkegaard here, right? Where feeling, experience, imagination, the areas of our psychic life in which we can locate what is fundamentally a religious attitude to life, right? And he said that in our feeling of absolute dependence, when you look within the human psyche, you can see a feeling of absolute dependence. When we look out into the universe, we see that universe, whether we believe in God or not, we look at that universe in awe, recognize our impotence, our littleness, right? Our ultimate dependence on everything around us. And so that feeling of absolute dependence is a feeling in which we can identify the religious a priori, right? That was a kind of alternative to Kant's practical reason. In Kant's practical reason, he saw God as a fundamental category of the practical understanding, right? And that was his religious a priori, but it was a rationalistic element. For Schleiermacher, it goes beyond the rationalistic, and it embraces almost the totality of human life. When you locate it in intuition, feeling, and imagination, then you're looking at a kind of totality, not merely a small faculty within human consciousness. Schleiermacher regarded religion as an autonomous sphere. And again, you can hear echoes of Kierkegaard here. Remember that Kierkegaard saw religion as a very, very authentic and significant sphere of human existence, right? First, there was the aesthetic in Kierkegaard, then that was followed by the ethical, and then the religious as the highest level of human consciousness, of human existence. And an autonomous sphere, a sphere that exists in its own right, not to be identified with lower spheres of human psychological activity. The religion, therefore, it occupies its own sphere. And if religion is a reality in human existence, then it cannot be rejected, it cannot be despised. What we need to do is perhaps revise many of our notions, but we cannot dismiss it or dispense with it. right? And it's a sphere in which piety reigns, in which our desire for holiness reigns. And piety and holiness go beyond the ethical, as Kierkegaard would have pointed out. Right? So central to the religious experience he sees is that feeling of absolute dependence, and therefore located in that, man always has a consciousness of God. That Christian God consciousness, right, is deeply embedded in the human psychic structures. And that God consciousness seeks, it recognizes our dependence on God's redemptive work. And he identifies that redemptive work as a redemptive work that is the work of Christ himself. Religious experiences, therefore, privilege over theological orthodoxy. Right? Schleiermacher was true to the Enlightenment movement, and therefore the religion that he preferred, right, or propagated, was a religion that corresponded very much to the contemporary scientific worldview. He did not accept such things as miracles. Right? Miracles were an impossibility. There are no leaps in nature. Right? He did not accept many of the theological dogma of the Christian church. He accepted the primacy of God, but the oneness of God. Trinitarian doctrine he regarded as, an incrustation on Christian theology that emerged somewhere in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Christian era. He rejected the notion of the two natures of Christ, or the existence of evil as an autonomous sphere outside of God. He did not see evil as the work of any other transcendent being, like Satan and so on. That was dismissed from his new theology. He rejected myth, and for the liberal theologians, many of the early stories in Genesis were regarded as mythical. The story of Adam and Eve, Genesis 2, for example, that whole section from Genesis 2, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, the story of the early patriarchs, the story of the flood, right? Most of these were regarded as mythical, and therefore the liberal theologians felt that they could dispense with that. In fact, their emphasis was largely on New Testamental theology. New Testamental theology, especially as it is articulated, as it is expressed in Christ's Sermon on the Mount. It was a new theology that privileged the ethical, right, over the metaphysical, over notions of transcendence and so on. It was a religion that really privileged immanence over transcendence. And liberal theology became quite popular among an intelligentsia within the Christian church. And what one finds is that, to a large extent, many modern theologians are still within that liberal tradition. The next theologian is Karl Barth, and Karl Barth died in 1968, so Karl Barth is very contemporary. Right? Barth came at the time after the First and Second World Wars, and he stoutly resisted. He was Swiss. He was, and the Swiss have been able to do that. They're probably the only people in Europe that were able to successfully resist Nazism and not receive, right, not be subject to the atrocities of the Nazis. But he stoutly resisted. He worked in Germany, he lectured in Germany, he stoutly resisted the Nazi movement. And that is one of the reasons why he had to eventually resort back to his homeland and become a pastor there. He spent a lot of his life as a pastor in the Reformed Church. In fact, many of these theologians that I'm talking about now are really in the Reformed movement. They are Calvinists. Remember that Protestant Christianity was split between two divisions to a large extent, right? And it still is split between two divisions. There's the Arminians, and Seventh-day Adventists are Arminians. Arminians are people who advance arguments similar to Pelagius in his debate with Augustine. And then there are the Calvinists, right, or the Reformed Church, right, the Calvinist movement, which are on the side of Augustine, right? So contemporary Christianity is Arminian, or it is Reformed or Calvinist, very much of it. That is not, there are certainly developments outside of that, but that is basically what is characteristic of there's a certain kind of dualism within contemporary Protestant Christianity. And as I said, Adventism is on the Armenian side, which stresses the role of the individual in the whole process of salvation, that man has to commit his will to God, that there, in a sense, ultimately there's a cooperation between man and God. It rejects double predestination and the notion of election by God alone, an election that certainly has nothing to do with whether we want to be good people or not. We are chosen by God from the foundation of the world. That kind of thing. So that Schleiermacher, right, really he purveys a sort of a Christianity that really, to a large extent, is much more on the side of ethics, on the side of human will, on the side of man's involvement in that whole process of creation. But he denies the existence of evil as a separate sphere outside of him. Right? He believes that God is unknowable. Right? He believes that God is unknowable, that we cannot know God, right, on our own, and therefore very much of the language of God is only our language of the experience of God. Now, Barth followed him, and as I said, Barth died in 1968, so Barth is a very modern theologian. And Barth came at the end of the Second World, during the Second World War. He lived during the Second World War. He wrote a lot after that World War. And Barth totally rejected liberal theology. He was very, very, very perturbed by the effects of liberal theology and the extent to which they had departed from what he considered the true faith. And he was prepared to restore traditional Christian orthodoxy, a Christianity that was, again, very heavily dependent on the Bible, a Christianity that accepted that the Bible as God's word and Christ as embodying, right, God as a part of the Trinity. He once more accepted the Trinitarian concept of God. Barth says that theology must begin with God, not man. He says that liberal theology was really a kind of anthropology. As I said just now, Schleiermacher saw talk of God as really talk of man's experience of God. And Barth was saying, no, in God's word and through revelation, we get a picture of God himself. Through Christ, we get a picture of God. And therefore, we have to begin, right, understanding human being by looking at God, not looking away from him, not looking at our experience of him, but looking at him in his true nature. And he saw Christ, right, as the proclamation of God. Christ as Jesus is victor. That was the term he used. Jesus is victor, that the Christ is Lord. And he celebrated the lordship of Christ. And in his preaching, that was his emphasis. But for Barth, God is unknowable. Even as for Schleiermacher, God really is unknowable. And Barth always continued to talk about the God as the holy order, God as subject. God is the subject in his relationship with the world. He's not an object of man's inquiry or of worship. He is the subject, right? And we are the objects. And we have to recognize him as the central player, right, in what we call the event of being. Very Kierkegaardian in that regard also, and in fact emphasizing something that Schleiermacher had said. But what Barth says is that we have an infinite qualitative difference or distance or distinction between God and man. There really is no similarity between God and man. A number of the previous theologians had really try to strike a point of meeting between God and man. Some area of human being, thought, existence, experience, where you could really see that similarity. And Christianity has always talked about the image of God in man. But Barth was not so much concerned with that at all. He established God as basically unknowable to man. Right? He's a given, but he's an unknowable given. Right? And there's a radical distinction between infinity and temporality, or time and eternity, between nature and grace. Remember that nature and grace is something that theology has always pointed to, the radical distinction, that dialectic between nature on the one hand and grace on the other. With grace, or God's gracious self-giving to man, we cannot explain that in rationalistic terms. Nature could be explained rationally and empirically. Grace is a divine attribute that God bestows on us. And in fact, our faith is what responds to that grace. Right? And so that radical dichotomy between man and God, between time and eternity, Barth came to refer to as a dialectic, a crisis essentially that exists within that relationship between God and man. And so we call the theology of Barth has been called a dialectical theology, or a theology of crisis, right? Barth's dialectical theology, Barth's theology of crisis, right, is a theology that to a large extent therefore sees very much of practice religion or institutionalized religion as idolatry, as unbelief, as self-righteousness. And he sees Christ as totally opposed to that. Now, when you look at the life of Christ, you realize that Christ's religion was existed outside of the corridors of the church. Right? He went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, but he spent the entire week, right, either on the mountaintops or in the valleys or in the cities and so on, spent it healing the sick, cleansing the leper and so on. It was a religion outside the confines of traditional Christianity. And in a way, Barth is pointing to that dimension of Christ's ministry as typifying essentially what ought to characterize true religion. Right? Barth speaks about the doctrine of analogy, and the doctrine of analogy is a very interesting one. That's a long history, going back to the Middle Ages, going back to especially Thomas Aquinas. The notion is that because God is unknowable, we can only use analogical language, right, in our theological discussions. The language of analogy, something referred to by Paul. Paul talks about, each individual according to the proportionality of his faith, having an access to an understanding of God, right? And proportionality is the English translation of analogia, right? Which Barth is using to define the nature of the nature of the language, right, that has to be used in theological predication. Analogical language is not univocal, nor is it equivocal, right? Univocal language is a language in which there seems to be a direct correspondence between word and object. We cannot establish a direct correspondence between word and object because the objects of the transcendent realm are objects that we do not really have words for. We can only get images. We can only find metaphors. We can only find pictures in order to communicate and correspond, that would correspond in order to communicate to each other, right? So equivocal language is a language that distorts and falsifies the object. The word and object have no correspondence. Analogical language stands somewhere in between univocal and equivocal language because there is no direct one-to-one correspondence between word and object. But even though there is no direct correspondence, we have to use the language of our own human experience to define the language to define the world of the transcendent. And that is why God is a father. We call God a father because we have fathers. God is the giver of all things because we receive things in the world from others, right? The language that we use in reference to God, right, is a language that is taken purely from human experience in the human world. Now, that is the doctrine of the analogy of being. And that is a doctrine that, as I said, can be traced back to the medievals, the notion of the analogy of being. But in the Barthian system, right, Barth is not very happy with the analogy of being. And what he substitutes is something that he calls the analogy of faith or the analogy of Christ. And in that analogy of faith or analogy of Christ, we do not take the objects of the human world or the experiences of the human world to define the transcendent. We take the objects of the transcendent world to define the human. That's a strange kind of notion. And I do not know how successful Barth really could have been in that enterprise. I'm not here to evaluate him, but I don't know how successful he could have been in that enterprise. But what he is saying is that when you talk about the fatherhood of God, the fatherhood of man, individual father, biological father, must reflect that fatherhood of God because God is the first father. It is not that God's fatherhood takes on similarities, right, derived from our experience of a human father. He is saying that the human father must reflect the qualities of God in his fatherhood to be a true father. So that we have to first of all look at God's qualities as father, and we find that in his word. A loving father, benevolent father, and so on. And his word reveals that to us, and Christ himself, as embodying the Godhead, reveals that to us. So very interesting, very important is Barth's analogy of faith or analogy of Christ, as replacing the analogy of being that was so characteristic of traditional theological discourse. But again, like Schleiermacher, did not believe that there was a separate sphere of evil. Remember that Augustine was the first to raise that issue. I may not have dealt with it at any length in Augustine. But if we go back to Augustine, Augustine says that evil does not exist, right? Evil is a privation of being. When we look at the realm of being or the realm of existence, wherever there's an abyss, wherever there's a break, right? That is where evil is. So evil really is a structural reality. And that notion was really a very popular notion, in spite of the fact that during the Middle Ages, even after Augustine, a number of demonologies and satanologies were developed within the Christian church, and many of them have survived. They have survived very much in contemporary, both Catholic and Protestant Christianity. They have not been replaced. That's a certain kind of substantiality given to evil. But the great theologians have always queried that. Schleiermacher did not accept that. And Barth's notion is that evil is really God saying no. It is God's no. He calls it the nihil. Nihil is a Latin word meaning nothing, N-I-H-I-L. He calls it the nihil, similar to Augustine's privative concept of good. When we say privative concept, not private, but privative, meaning having to do with privation, privation having to do with absence, absence having to do with annihilation, nothingness, right? And so Barth sees evil as existing within the shadow of God's light, right? It exists not in a separate ontological realm. It lacks that ontological substantiality. It really has what we can refer to as a structural reality. It's a structural reality, some kind of cavity, void within the continuum of being. And that is an important notion because we're going to find it reflected in the next theologian that we're dealing with. Barth wrote a massive book called Church Dogmatics, and there's also a very popular one called the Epistle to the Romans. Epistle to the Romans is the book in which he really pulled apart a lot that was significant in and characteristic of liberal theology. In his Church Dogmatics, there are 13 volumes of it. Barth has been writing and writing. I don't know if there's anyone who has ever read all of the 13 volumes. It's massive writing, millions of words written. Barth was able to expound that theology. It's really an unfinished document. And Barth is regarded as one of the greatest theologians of all time, given the massive nature of his work and contribution to theology and the radical implications, right, of his coming to the table with a radically different view, right, of God's relationship with man and the place of religion in human life. So Barth's Church Dogmatics is a massive document, and Barth is ranked with people like Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, and Calvin, right? He's ranked with these great giants in Christian theology. And he has had a powerful influence. In fact, can't remember which pope it is, but one of the recent popes referred to Barth as the greatest theologian of the Christian church, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Barth was not a Catholic theologian, he's a Protestant theologian. One of the interesting things I should mention when you look at denominational differences is that among the theologians, those differences do not seem to exist. Yes, they're there. They belong to the different and separate religions, and many of their liturgical practices would differ. But essentially what separates theologians are philosophical differences, not denominational differences. And you will find people who are Kantian on both sides of the camp. You're going to find idealists on both sides of the camp. You're going to find people advocating a theology that can be called analytical theology on both sides of the camp. Right? And so that you do not have those kinds of separate, radically separate divisions among theologians at the level of academia. The next theologian is Paul Tillich. And Paul Tillich is often regarded as a theologian of the intellectuals. Very heavily dependent again on many of them who very much influenced by Heidegger. Even Barth himself was influenced by Heidegger. Just as Schleiermacher would have been influenced by Kant and Kierkegaard and so on, you find that Heidegger had a powerful influence on Paul Tillich. Tillich again was a German, but he lectured in North America, and he wrote a book. He wrote some very interesting books. One, The Protestant Era. Another very beautiful book is my first introduction to Tillich when I was quite young. A book called The Courage to Be, right, which strikes you as being very existentialist. And then there's a systematic theology, 3 volumes of his systematic theology. One of the things that Tillich did was that he identified God with being itself. Again, you can see how very evident the influence of Heidegger has been on Paul Tillich. God is being himself. And our concepts of God, our images of God are merely symbols, right? They're merely pictures of that ultimacy, right? That is unutterable and indefinable, right? God is the ground of all being, right? So as far as Tillich is concerned, you do not ascribe either existence or non-existence to God, because all existence is grounded on him. So he is not one with that existence, right? So you don't talk about God in terms either of existence or non-existence as the ground of being. And that's a very difficult concept to grasp, right? He also is regarded as a dialectical theologian, right? Tillich is a dialectical theologian, very much like Barth. He was very, very heavily influenced by Barth. There was a rejection basically of very much of the liberal theology that he had inherited also. But when you look closely at him, he does share a fair amount of that liberalism in the way in which he deals with issues, social and experiential issues, right? For example, Barth saw that Tillich argued that we live in 2 orders, right? And these 2 orders are radically opposed to each other. In fact, his theology is called a theology of culture. because we live both in the realm of immanence and the realm of transcendence, the two orders, the realm of culture being the realm of immanence, and the realm of religion being the realm of transcendence, the mystical. Right? Tillich's radical dichotomy between these two orders in which we live did not dissociate these two orders from each other, because he saw that you could only articulate, and again, that goes back to the notion of analogy and preaching as analogical predication. You can only talk about the transcendent in terms of the secular, in terms of the cultural, right? He is both, he sees himself in both in this world and above the world, right? He sees God ultimately at the depth of human experience, at the ground of human experience. But our experience really is an experience within this world. Tillich's theology, Christology is really an adoptionist Christology. Doesn't accept the incarnation, and here is where he shares something with the liberals, as I mentioned before, right? But if you read the book of Mark, you really get the impression that Christ adopted, God adopted Christ at the baptism, right? It is Matthew and Luke who talk about the incarnation or suggest the incarnation. They actually don't use the word, but they suggest the incarnation because they deal with the birth of Christ. But Mark doesn't deal with the birth of Christ. He starts with the baptism, right? He starts with the announcement of Christ by the coming of Christ by John the Baptist, and then with the baptism. So it can strike you as an adoptionist Christology. And that is the Christology that Tillich accepts. He sees, however, the notion of justification by faith as the Protestant principle. He calls the notion of justification by faith that which characterizes Protestant Christianity, certainly from the theology of, and he's very much opposed to works. In fact, in Tillich's dispensation, belief is also a form of works. Very often we believe that the right belief is important for salvation. If you don't believe the right things in the right way, you can't be saved. Tillich is saying that demand for right belief is also a works demand. It also suggests that you're going to be saved by belief, which is a form of works. And he rejects that. In fact, Tillich uses a term that is very, very radical and revolutionary. He talks about justification by doubt. And that brought a very significant element into theological discourse, because a number of theologians were saying that there is something as honest doubt. And there are a number of aspects of the charisma, of the dogma of the Christian church, right, that a modern mind would doubt. And that doubt is an honest doubt. And it's a doubt that God would accept, because God justifies us by grace, by grace through faith. It has nothing to do with works, and it has nothing to do with beliefs, because in Tillich's world, beliefs are also a form of works. And that's a very interesting notion, because it leaves room for radical differences in terms of our theological understandings within the Protestant camp. It leaves considerable room for that. Tillich accepted that there was a difference between the God of history and the Christ of faith, right? That has been a lot of research, as I said initially, was done in that department. And people recognize that the picture of God that we have, in the Gospels may not necessarily correspond to who Christ was, identical in an identical manner with who Christ was when he lived on earth. He also denied the literalness of notions like the incarnation and the resurrection. And he believed that eternal life is something that we enjoy right here in this world. He didn't see an eternal life in the hereafter. Eternal life is enjoyed right here in this world. The last theologian I'm dealing with is Rudolf Bultmann. And Bultmann also is a 20th century theologian. He was a New Testament scholar, also German. Notice that all of these guys are German. Germany was now leading the way in theological discourse as it was leading the way in philosophical discourse, right? And he is a New Testament scholar. right? But he argued that when you read Heidegger, then the message of Heidegger is, he says, identical to the message of Christ, enunciated in the first century. They are 20 centuries apart, and therefore the language must differ. But he's saying, now, remember when we read Heidegger, we saw the correspondences with his Christian upbringing, his Christian antecedents, right? Heidegger was a seminarian, right? And his philosophy very much sounds like Christian philosophy, with notions of fallenness and authenticity and guilt and so on. But he de-theologized his philosophy. He stripped it of all its theological elements. And Heidegger is saying that you can take his philosophy and you can re-theologize it and essentially make it something that is palatable to a contemporary modern consciousness, mind, right? So, and what he's famous for is his program of what he calls demythologizing the Gospels, right? It's a different position than the position of the liberals. What the liberals did was that they discarded what they considered to be mythical elements. Bultmann is not saying that you should discard what is considered to be mythical elements, but you have to demythologize them and find their true spiritual meanings. You have to rescue those meanings and re-articulate them in a language that is intelligible to the modern mind. So the notion of demythologization became a very prominent notion in Christian hermeneutics. Right, a considerable degree of Christian hermeneutes and people and exegetes, people who are interpreting the Bible, consider among of those who are based in academia, really are, sometimes even if they do not admit it, involved in that process of this mythologization, right? And so the notion of demythologizing the New Testament, and their concentration is really on the New Testament. Demythologizing the New Testament is a significant function. In fact, it is now basically an intellectual and moral obligation for the New Testament scholar and for the contemporary Christian theologian. So Bultmann's theology really is a theology that is very existentialist, right? Its categories is existential categories, right? He talks about the notion of Dasein and fallenness and guilt and being towards death and or various ways of being, right? And the need to re-achieve a certain kind of human authenticity. This is the kind of language that you get in Bultmann's theologizing, right? And Bultmann, to my mind, very many theologians will have a serious problem with Bultmann. I know that our school of theology would have a very serious problem with Bultmann, right? But Bultmann really communicated to an audience that was in a way waiting to hear that kind of pronouncements, to retain some semblance of faith. And so that he has performed a very positive function in the realm of Christian theology. And that brings me to the end of the discussion. I'm sorry that I had to leave out other theologians. I've left out, for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a famous theologian and who was now advocating a kind of religionless Christianity. He saw, like Barth, Christianity as idolatry. That's institutionalized Christianity as idolatry, and was preaching a new kind of Christianity that was contained in good works, right? Bonhoeffer is a man who talks about cheap grace and the fact that a lot of contemporary Christianity is really about cheap grace. And we need to go back to a costly grace. That is something that Adventism has always espoused. Those who are familiar with Bonhoeffer, they love that part of it because the Adventist notion of grace is really a costly grace, a grace that takes law into account, not a cheap grace that is antinomian and discards all laws. And that is what Bonhoeffer was totally opposed to. And then there's the great Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner. Right? And I'm sorry I can't do Rahner, but what Rahner was involved in, and Rahner is perhaps second to Barth, greatest Catholic theologian of the 20th century. And Karl Rahner was trying to identify deep within the human psyche that religious a priori, that serves as the grounding for our recognition of the necessity of religion, right? So the contemporary period is a period that is extremely exciting in terms of theology. And I'm sure that many of you are going to go on to explore these things when you do graduate work. As I said, I hope that some of you will get into the area of systematics, because we need systematic theologians here in the Caribbean, right? Not only New Testament scholars and so on, right? And people trained in pastoral theology. We need men who can really find the faith essentially in Caribbean terms, taking our own Caribbean experience into account. And we also need philosophers within the church, Christian philosophers, who will provide the necessary philosophical support to the systematic theologians and to the other theologians who are practicing. Remember that ultimately the preacher in the pulpit, right, depends on that whole range of intellectual activity that is taking place. No longer a very simplistic kind of theology can be offered to many contemporary audiences, right? Much of the evangelism that we do here, like the one that ended recently with Pastor Morgan, it's really a very simple theology that is offered to the folk. But you can't go to university communities, university trained people who have been inducted into the sciences and inducted into very many of the thought movements of the 20th century, and deliver something as simplistic as that. And therefore, our theologians, our preachers are going to have to address audiences that are far more sophisticated. And so we expect that our graduates that are coming out of the schools will be able to recognize the various functions, right, within the area of academic theology, the various spheres of career pathways, right, and spheres of influence that are going to develop, and are going to prepare themselves for the tremendous apologetic task that confronts 21st century Christianity. And that brings me to the end of the lecture and to the end of the course. And I hope that people have enjoyed it, have benefited from it, and I hope that it has impacted you in a very significant manner.